Welcome to this video looking at the Sarah Everard case, particularly in the context of sociological issues for the Crime and Deviance paper. So just before we get into this discussion, what I wanted to emphasize is that this is an ongoing investigation, and therefore I'm not going to comment about the events that have taken place, the case itself, or those connected to it. This isn't going to be an account or a summary of Sarah Everard's life, her final days. You know, this was a horrific case, and it's really important that we remember this and we respect Sarah Everards and her family and friends who knew and loved her. So as such, this is going to be a discussion of the wider social reactions, the consequences, the actions, the events that have taken place after this this case, and obviously the following events of the horrific news that's taken place. So obviously just want to clarify this before we get into this, that this is more of a reflection of what's happened since the case has broke and not about the case itself. So just to remind you what the case is, so this case involves the disappearance and consequent murder of Sarah Everard. Obviously what was significant about this case was that the accused is a member of the police, and as such it's also highlighted a number of debates around women and keeping women safe. Following her death, there was a vigil that was held in Clapham Common, and this led to, again, more controversial police response, and it led to lots of discussions about female safety. As I say, this came from the Wikipedia entry, so if you want to explore this, you can look at it a bit more, but as I say, it's quite a high profile case which you may already be aware of. This case was really important because there were lots of issues raised following the initial case. And particularly what this highlighted was obviously issues with police handling of assaults and abuse cases in the past, how women have been treated by the criminal justice system, but also the wider issue of women being treated unequally in society. So what this has highlighted, that women have felt ignored, unsupported, unprotected in a number of aspects of social life, particularly the idea that women have to put up additional responses, additional protections in order to complete quite everyday tasks such as going to the shop, going to work. This case has also highlighted a number of connections to inequalities faced by a number of marginalised groups based on gender, for those from the trans community, from different sexualities, those from different minority groups. So again, very significant for a number of reasons. This has also been a case which has been sort of quite high profile across the whole of society, with discussions and responses from politicians, the police and the public. The responses and the issues that have come from this, there's lots of different responses and lots of different issues that have been raised. So one of the issues highlighted was potentially the underreporting of violence against women, and almost the fact that a lot of violence against women has been ignored. The acceptance of violence, harassment and abuse women face as part of life. So a lot of women are facing harassment, abuse, and it's just part of everyday living. It highlights that inequality is persistent, it's often overlooked, or it's unrecognised by society. One real example of this was the suggestion of a curfew on men put forward by Baroness Jenny Jones, and particularly the reactions of society and men and groups that this was unfair, unjust, unequal. And it was partially put forward to highlight that there is this almost unofficial curfew on women through fear, attack. So it's just to highlight an issue. There's been a lot of debates. The not all men groups have been quite prominent in that, not all men do this, but it does highlight the fact that a small proportion of attackers are genuinely men, and therefore the fear of all men or the distrust or these reactions are acceptable. I also found quite interesting a lot of debates and discussions around what if your mother, your sister, your wife was to experience this, and almost the idea that in order to encourage men to take an action or take a stance on this debate, you have to provide some kind of emotional or relationary account to them. So not that women experience this and we should be stepping in, but particularly if your mother or sister or wife experiences this, you should step up. So again, I also found that was an interesting narrative in terms of trying to encourage men to participate by, that they should take action by association of a relation experience in this. Discussions about toxic masculinity have continued and just been sort of encouraged by this, but also the discussion about how we need to change and update laws. Now, there are lots of connections with this case and subsequent discussions that are kind of prominent for crime and deviance. One such example is looking at crime statistics. Now, as I said, all the links that are in here will be placed into the description, but I found some interesting case study examples. So particularly the first one was about how many violent attacks and sexual assaults on women are there. This was a whole BBC News article looking at attacks on women, and it highlighted that in the year ending March 2020, so just around the time lockdown began, the Office for National Statistics estimated that 4.9 million women had been victims of sexual assault in their lives. This included 1.4 million who had been raped or faced attempted rape. About 989,000 men had experienced sexual assault, including 87,000 victims of rape and assault. However, in total of all these attacks from men and women, 98.5% of the rapists were identified as men. So again, the debate about not all men, but it does highlight that almost 100% of attackers are men. Official statistics also kind of brought into discussion about how many don't provide estimates of how many women face sexual assault or harassment. And particularly the suggestions was that 7 out of 10 women had experienced some form of harassment in public. This number was nearly 9 out of 10 for younger women. Over half of women have experienced catcalling. 4 out of 10 have been groped or faced unwelcome touching. A third of women have been followed, and 1 in 5 have faced indecent exposure. One of the things that's come about following these discussions is the suggestion to change the way police are recording crimes and looking at motivations based on gender or sex, which will be introduced on an experimental basis, hopefully encourage more of these crimes to be recorded on police databases to get a full picture of what is happening. This kind of relates to the dark figure of crime. A lot of these crimes are unreported because of embarrassment, fear that they won't be helped, that they'll be humiliated, it's too trivial, that nothing will be done. So this has a lot of connection to crime data and crime stats. In terms of feminism as a broader concept, we can look at sort of case studies from the past. So Dobash and Dobash talked about violence against wives. We can talk about how for feminists and postmodernists, male crime has always been a topic of investigation, particularly trying to explain what it is about men that makes them commit more crime. And one sort of study that's developed this would be Messerschmitt, who argues that masculinity is socially constructed, something men have to constantly work to accomplish. So some men are able to achieve masculinity through legitimate means. So, those through employment, through their roles in the family, being successful. But there are some men who have to use crime in order to achieve masculinity. And part of this criminal behavior could be the sexual intimidation, harassment, or assaults on women as a means of achieving masculinity. As I say, Messerschmitt argues that working class men need to do this to accomplish masculinity, but I think broader discussions is that it can be men, middle class men, all men are capable of these crimes or ways of intimidation. A few other examples that kind of I felt had a connection here. So following obviously the discussions of this case, there have been other news articles appeared. So one woman who was assaulted and attacked by a police officer who was not on duty but was drunk, and argued that she was stalking him and then formed some kind of assault or arrest on her. He was found guilty of doing that, but didn't face any charges for misconduct. He was given a £500 fine and put on curfew, an evening curfew, while in lockdown. So it kind of wasn't a curfew at all, really. There have been articles that talked about how the incidents of Sarah Everards' case have highlighted that women cannot decide when they will be harmed by a man, and the idea being that women who have faced assaults in the past are reminded that they can be victimized again or at any point. So again, that wider notion of fear and a way of oppressing women in society. And one other discussion that's also been taking place that I feel quite relevant here was, again, related to gender and to statistics. It also has a connection to postmodernism later, is that misogyny could be recorded as a hate crime in a bid to reduce and also log the scale of abuse that women are facing. Again, all these discussions have come about as a result of this case. There are other areas which are connected to this case as well. So functionalism, Marxism, New Right, postmodernism, and the realism theories can have application of this case. So within functionalism, Durkheim talks about how crime occurs because in society it has a purpose, it has a role to perform. Now, as I say, I'm not talking about the death of Sarah Everard as the case that was functional here. I'm referring more to this case, the vigil and the protest that sort of took place as a way of highlighting issues. So the first one says enable social change, functional rebellion. So women attending the vigil, which had been banned by police in order to pay their respects to raise awareness of their concerns and their issues, led to the arrest of a number of women. This further highlighted issues of gender inequality and a relationship with the police. So in this case, rebellion and deviance was functional in enforcing change. Boundary maintenance can be as connected here with the idea that the news reporting on the death of Sarah Everard has been discussed in all aspects of society. This has led to greater discussion about gender inequality, sexual harassment of women, discussions about how not to treat women, and therefore reinforcing boundaries. When it comes to social cohesion, the horrific case, the news, has unified communities in their reaction. And again, the vigil and the notes and the flowers that have been left following this case kind of demonstrate the unity that's been created, the mutual disgust and kind of outrage at what's happened. This also could act as an early warning device. So this was talked about within Durkheim's study to highlight problems in society and maybe prevent them escalating or becoming worse. So in this case, it could be a systematic reminder of inequalities in society. These inequalities are ongoing and have been around for a significant period of time. They haven't changed massively, but this could be one of those things that catalyzes change and encourages social policymakers and society to become more aware of the problem. Within Marxism, again, it's quite a loose connection. Marxism talks about law creation, law enforcement being selective, and often the ruling class create laws that protect their interests. One of the bills that has been highlighted during these debates was the policing bill. And opposition MPs have claimed that this policing bill would put a restriction on people's rights to protest. So a lot of this came back from the initial vigil for Sarah Everard being cancelled or being discouraged on the grounds of COVID. It also then highlighted that this bill was being introduced. Part of the debate around this bill was that it was going to protect women and increase women's protection, and actually what's been found is that the bill doesn't really do that. It doesn't increase sentences. The only thing that's being really protected here is putting a higher sentence on people who damage statues. It also gives the government and police more power to stop protests, which have been proven to be an effective form of making change. So again, it silences people, it removes human rights. That's been a big discussion that's developed from this. The solid social control, the policymakers putting controls to stop forms of protest or opposition to those in power. Neomarxism is also quite interesting. Neomarxism has this full social theory of deviance, and it looks at almost the ripple effect. So it looks at an act of deviance and then also the wider social causes and also the social reaction. I applied the Sarah Everard case to their theory. So on the left-hand side, you can see Taylor and Now's full social theory of deviance, the act itself being number 3, and then anything above that, 1, 2, being the wider causes, and then 4, 5, and 6 being the wider reaction. So it's essentially you've got this Marxist macro approach, 1, 2 on the table, and then 4, 5, 6 is the sort of smaller micro interactionist responses. Now, as I say, this is an ongoing case. It's not one that's been finalised, therefore this doesn't fit perfectly and it may change, but this is what I found in the first few days of this case. So if you think about the wider origins of deviance, we're going to go right to the very top and then we'll work our way down. So government is in quite a chaotic state. Problems with Brexit, the failure to manage COVID, the 1% pay rise for nurses, the government found to act unlawfully with PPE contracts, the Home Secretary Priti Patel being found guilty of bullying staff. So there's a lot of problems within government. There are even more that have come about. So, you know, the cost of the TV studio being built in Downing Street, the cost of the PM's home renovations and privately sourcing funds from charities and organisations to do that. So lots of problems within government and society. The immediate origins obviously was the kidnap and murder of Sarah Everard by the police officer. And particularly the fact that there were suggestions that he may have indecently exposed himself in a takeaway restaurant 3 days before the kidnap and murder. So it was known that he had engaged in some form of deviant behaviour, some form of criminal action. It also highlights wider discussions about violence against women, toxic masculinity, the not all men, and also debates about, you know, sort of suggestions of why was she out that late at night? Why was she walking home alone? Again, questioning her motives, not her rights to be able to do that. The act itself was the vigil, which was cancelled by police. Large people still attended. It was then deemed a protest and illegal under COVID restrictions, and therefore there was a lot of scuffles with police as they tried to close it down. The media outrage of this response was the main thing, and I'll see what I've got here are some of the media responses. So Scotland Yard claimed people went to the vigil prepared for disorder. We've got news articles here about female police officers being mishandled, that it was about, you know, the purpose was missed, that it became a protest. There's been talks about how it was hijacked by anti-police protesters. There was even, again, this was a big debate about the vigil. You know, MPs criminalising freedom to protest, the government sort of bringing in these policies to reduce noise limits on protests, people calling BBC Breakfast and sort of arguing that their campaign and their reporting of it was too woke for discrediting the police's action. So there's a lot of stuff we can link here to Taylor and Howe's theory. Now, the media reaction, as I said, we've covered it. It blamed the protesters and criticised, obviously, the event. The wider origins of the reaction was the fear. Women have a shared experience of oppression, discrimination, harassment. That's what led to the vigil and people want to stand out. There was also wider reactions to the curfew suggested by Baroness Jones, and also discussions that have shifted to measures against protesting. So again, the government bringing in the bill to reduce and limit powers of protest. And then the wider effects, the labelling, the bigger picture here is obviously the reaction of government. So we're seeing that the suggestions of placing undercover police in bars, increasing CCTV and lighting. Again, a lot of this is reactionary response, not dealing with the issue. And as it says, you know, not looking at the root cause of issues, but almost virtue signalling responses by we will do this to deal with it, but not actually change anything in society. The police has brought in, obviously, protections for statues or policies to bring in statues, protection, increased punishment. So it's, the full theory was the idea about this is drawing attention away from the failings of the top towards the issue at the bottom. And this is what this theory has done so far. There's also been a big focus, as I said, about this new policing bill and about how this will remove rights of protest. So part of the discussion, more of the focus is now on this bill and not on the wider causes of it. Postmodernism talks about social harm, and Henry and Milanovic talk about social harms, the harms of reduction, the harms of repression, how particularly in this case women are repressed. And this applies to this case because there have been a lot of discussions about the actions of men to oppress, repress women, and obviously this is what needs to be stopped. If we were looking at it from a social harm argument, the idea of harm as a more useful way of dealing with criminal offences, we could cover all these actions on the screen here as harms of repression, which would make them illegal, make them punishable. However, these offences are not punishable by law, and therefore, you know, they're not considered to be a legal issue. These are almost acceptable things women have had to deal with, or not acceptable, sorry. These are things women have had to deal with, which have been generally accepted by society and not seen as a problem. However, women have had to deal with this for a considerable period of time. Postmodernists also link into surveillance. We mentioned about undercover police officers in bars. So if you think about Foucault and the surveillance society, this would add to the surveillance. And there's been discussion about how the idea of the phantom boyfriend, when women are being harassed or asked persistently by men for drink stuff, the idea of a phantom boyfriend is often, I've got a boyfriend. Men will respect the phantom boyfriend authority figure than respecting the woman in front of them. And last but not least, last areas here. So left realism is all about trying to deal with the causes of crime. So some of the discussions about how we should provide education, teach boys from a younger age, particularly through subjects like PSC or sex education, about treatment of women, respecting women to help women feel safer. This would be a kind of dealing with the cause of the crime, dealing with the cause and the issues, rather than a preemptive or responsive way of dealing with it. And then right realism has connections as well, particularly, as I said, with that new policing bill. This is dealing with the consequences of the crime, not dealing with the cause and why there is inequality of women, why there is this level of treatment of women in society, but it's quite reactionary. So, this bill suggests it's going to increase sentences for lower level offences and placing police in bars. It's how we deal with it, zero tolerance, or try and reduce opportunities for the offence, but not actually deal with the cause of them. So there we have it. So a discussion of how this contemporary issue case can be applied to crime and deviance questions and crime and deviance theory. As I said at the very beginning, hopefully I hope I've dealt with this respectfully and I've not made too many mistakes or said anything inappropriate there. But the main point I'm trying to make here is that this is a really prominent and quite significant case. This is sociology in action. Society is taking action and changing. So one of the things to do, and one of the things that's really important to do here, is just keep an eye on the news, think about how it might link to what you are learning in the lesson. As always, I hope this has been of some use. Please like and subscribe if you found it useful. Please tell your friends. And again, if I have made any errors, if there's anything you disagree with what I've said, I will leave comments open. I'm happy to talk about this. As I say, I'm not going to change my views, but as I said, if I've made any errors or I've said anything wrong or inappropriate or not correct, then please do tell me. I think the best way in light of all this is that by having these discussions, we can hopefully improve the way we have narratives and how society works. As always, thanks for watching.